My name is Ammon Bundy. I'm the third son of Clive and Bundy. I prepared this video for a couple reasons. One is a lot of people have asked me about the direction this country is going and what I feel is the main concern that we should be worried about. Also, I offer this video to you as a warning of what may come if we do not correct the things that are happening.
It's October now.
I know.
It's more than 12 months. You're a free man.
I'm here now on my own accord.
I'm honored to have you with us. Honored.
Shoulder! Arms! Shoulder! Arms! Forward! March!
The federal government has not been given authority by the people to act the way they are. Most of the acts of Congress over the last 50 years have not been authorized by the people. Federal agencies are ramping up military-like forces to compel the American people into abiding by their codes, and the Supreme Court continually rules on matters that they do not have jurisdiction over.
Does the Supremacy Clause prohibit the states from their rightful remedy? Because your federal supremacist friend will say, well, the Supremacy Clause says that federal law trumps state law. Is that what it really says? How about we listen to Alexander Hamilton instead of a Supreme Court justice or a federal court judge? Hamilton says no legislative act contrary to the Constitution can be valid. That's exactly what the Supremacy Clause says, by the way. Let's look at it. The Supremacy Clause, Article 6, Section 2 of the Constitution declares, "This Constitution and the laws of the United States which shall be made in pursuance thereof shall be the supreme law of the land." You see, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Nothing else has to happen. It is the Constitution, therefore it is supreme. However, the laws created by Congress, and may I also submit the regulations made by agencies, are only the supreme law of the land when they are made in pursuance to the Constitution. Not every law is supreme, only the ones that fit under the Constitution. You can't have federal laws and Constitution on equal footing, because then all it takes is one law that supersedes the Constitution. Then the Constitution's not supreme anymore. And if the Constitution is not supreme, from where does the Congress get their authority? Just themselves. Hamilton said, "No legislative act, therefore, contrary to the Constitution can be valid." You know what he's telling us? That if the federal government is creating laws that are not consistent with the Constitution, they are no law at all.
Forcing the states into undue obedience. I would like to briefly cover the purpose in which the people organized the federal government, what authority the people gave the federal government, and how federal agencies today are the greatest threat the American people have ever faced. Before the federal government was created, the states had existed for several years. The states were doing well inside their borders, the people were thriving and enjoying their newfound freedoms. Economics were good, morale was high, and general social ethics were honored. However, When it came to matters outside the state, such as trade with other countries, disputes between two or more states, the defense against other nations, or the expansion and growth of the country, the current system was weak. Without an orderly system to handle these matters, the states surely would begin fighting amongst each other, and possibly even be conquered by an outside force.
Article 6, Clause 2 of the Constitution is known as the Supremacy Clause. This clause in our Constitution is often misquoted, misapplied, and misinterpreted. Those who support an overgrown and supreme federal power like to use this clause to beat the states into a powerless submission to every assertion of federal authority. Is that really what the designers of our Constitution meant when they placed this clause into the Constitution? The Supremacy Clause reads, "This Constitution and the laws of the United States which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution or laws of the state to the contrary notwithstanding." A plain reading of this text tells us several things. Number one, the Constitution shall be the supreme law of the land. 2, the laws of the United States which shall be made in pursuance to the Constitution are the supreme law of the land. 3, treaties made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. You see, the Constitution, through this clause, has been established as the highest standard of law regarding the federal government. The laws of the United States are below the Constitution. Treaties of the United States must be made under the authority of the Constitution. As far as the federal government is concerned, there is nothing higher than the Constitution. Alexander Hamilton explains the underlying principle of this clause in Federalist 78. He says there is no position which depends on clearer principles than that every act of delegated authority, contrary to the tenor of the commission under which it is exercised, is void. No legislative act, he says, therefore, contrary to the Constitution, can be valid. James Madison explains in Federalist 45 that the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined, and those powers are to be principally exercised upon foreign affairs, such as war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce. According to Hamilton, when the federal government exercises powers that have not been delegated through the Constitution, the acts performed through that unauthorized power are null and void. What that means is, if Congress passes a law and that law is not made consistent with the powers delegated by the Constitution, then that law is completely invalid. Thomas Jefferson reasserts this concept in the Kentucky Resolution of 1798. He says, wherever the general government assumes undelegated powers, its acts are unauthoritative, void, and of no force. The Supremacy Clause codifies this very principle that any law made by Congress that is not made in pursuance to the Constitution is no law at all. A law made by Congress that is not made pursuant to the Constitution is not authorized by any expressly delegated power. It is not the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state are not bound by it. The Supremacy Clause does not make every law of Congress, every act of Congress, every federal regulation, or every Supreme Court opinion superior to state laws and state constitution. It's the exact opposite. The states agreed amongst one another to be bound by their mutual compact, the Constitution, not to subject themselves to every whim of their creation. The Supremacy Clause, in fact, puts the federal government on notice that their every act is limited by the power delegated through the Constitution. The Supremacy Clause is not a limit of state authority. It is not a statement of supremacy of the federal government over the power of the states. The Supremacy Clause tells those in the federal government that their power is limited by the Constitution, and that the states do not have to submit to every imposed authority of the federal government that is not made consistent with the powers delegated by the Constitution, which the states themselves created.
In 1787, 11 years after the American people declared independence from King George III, the states' delegates came together in Philadelphia to discuss how they may resolve the concerns involving the unity of the states. The weakness of the current system was defined as fourfold: 1. Foreign trade; 2. Resolving conflicts between states; 3. Defense of the states from foreign threats; and the proper way to grow and expand. Over 4 months and through much deliberation, a simple one-page document with 7 articles was drafted to resolve these problems. We know this document as the United States Constitution. In this document, it proposed that the states create a federal government, a central government, or a general government, and delegate these 4 main responsibilities to it: matters of foreign trade, an appeals court between 2 or more states, matters of national defense, and matters of growth and expansion of the nation. The document made it very clear to how the federal government would be organized, and was very specific to what authority and responsibility the people were delegating to this government. When the states' delegates presented the Constitution to the people, many were very concerned that it would give the proposed central government too much power. The delegates assured the people through many written and verbal communications that the Constitution was drafted to only give very specific power to the federal government, only enough power to perform the specific duties listed. Virginians and New Yorkers were so concerned about the Constitution creating a central government that would dissolve the states' power and put them back in the situation they just fought against, that they resisted ratifying the Constitution until amendments were promised to be added. Amendment 1 through 10, known as the Bill of Rights, was added to make it clear that the people were not giving the federal government power to make rules or regulations on just anything. Amendment 10 alone reads that if it is not listed in the Constitution, then the federal government does not have authority from the people to be making laws or acting on it. The people, through the Constitution, gave the federal government authority to act for 1. International trade, national defense, including border security, serve as an appeals court so 2 or more states can resolve conflicts, administer acquired or conquered land until the land becomes a state, along with a few other listed responsibilities such as post offices. Beyond these, they have not been given authority from the people or the states. Beyond these, the states and therefore the people have reserved the power to themselves. For example, let's look at our schools. Where in the Constitution does it list the federal government's authorization to administer and regulate education? It does not.
If you care about your children, you'll get the federal government out of the business of educating our kids. In 1980, when the Republican Party ran, part of the platform was to get rid of the Department of Education. By the year 2000, it was eliminated, and we fed on to it. Then we, as Republicans, added No Child Left Behind. So the first thing a president should do is that the goal should be set to get the government out completely, but don't enforce this law of No Child Left Behind. It's not going to do any good, and nobody likes it. And there's no value to it. The teachers don't like it, and the students don't like it. But there are other things that the federal government can do, and that is give tax credits for the people who will opt out. We ought to have a right to opt out of the public system if you want.
Where in the Constitution does it list the federal government's authority to administer and regulate the environment? It does not.
And on the environment is very, very important. People who are true conservatives and libertarians, they have no right to pollute their neighbor's property. You have no right to pollute your neighbor's air, or water, or anything. And this would all contribute to the protection of all air and water. I don't believe we have the authority or the ability to go over and tell China exactly what to do, but setting a good example and to spread the information around would teach people that you don't have a right to pollute. During the Industrial Revolution, we did exactly the opposite. Property rights were rejected. They did not recognize the fact that corporations didn't have the right to pollute. There was a collusion between big corporations and governments that allowed the pollution. I mean, the governments participated in it. And once again, the worst pollution ever was in the Soviet system, you know, and the cows and the environment and property went to the dogs. So property is better protected when people own the property than when the government takes it and rules over that property, assuming they're doing it in the interest of all people.
Where does it list the federal government's authority to own or control mass amounts of land inside the state? It does not.
Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2 says this: the Congress shall have power to dispose of and make all needful regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States. And nothing in this Constitution shall be so construed as to prejudice any claims of the United States or of any particular state. Okay, let's break that down and look at it. First of all, Congress shall have power to make all needful regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States. Very, very clear. Congress, the federal government, is in charge of the federal territories. Okay? And prior to 1890, in Wyoming's specific case, we were a federal territory, and they made the rules that governed the territory of Wyoming. Okay? But on July 10th, 1890, Congress passed a bill for the Enabling Act to make Wyoming a state, the 44th state in the Union. Okay? And we took our place on equal footing as the other 43 states in the Union, and we became a state. We are no longer a territory, and therefore, Congress no longer had authority to make regulations and be in charge of the state of Wyoming, because we're not a territory anymore, we're now a state. Now, the Enabling Act itself says this: it provides that the land shall be held, appropriated, and disposed of exclusively for the purposes herein mentioned, as the state legislature may provide. Okay, so it's clear that the land within the state of Wyoming is to be managed by who? The state legislature. Okay, pretty easy. So federal agencies still exist within the state and still claim jurisdiction. They're here only out of ignorance. We've chosen to let them. Okay, ignorance and apathy, and if we were willing to submit to federal tyranny. The federal government has no jurisdiction within the state. It's now a state. It's not a territory. Okay, so BLM, for example. BLM was originally authorized, the Bureau of Land Management is originally authorized to use the Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2 power to dispose of lands. That's what the Bureau of Land Management was to do, was to dispose of it, get it into the hands of private citizens, into the state. But what have they done? They've set up shop here. They've been here for over 100 years, acting as our land managers. They're not our land managers. We need to get them out and say, you have no jurisdiction here. Because once you get these federal agencies who say they have jurisdiction, then all of a sudden we have to obey whatever the federal government says. But that's unnatural for the federal government to be telling us in our own local communities what you'll do with your land, how you'll manage this, what you can and can't do. It's unnatural for a bureaucrat in D.C. to be doing that. Or even to have a field office here and say, oh, yeah, we work for the federal government. The federal government doesn't have any jurisdiction here.
And where does it list the federal government's authority to administer and regulate public health and safety? It does not. So I ask you this question. If the federal government does not have authority from the people to be acting the way they are, then with what authority are they acting on? Can the legislative, executive, or judicial branches of the federal government act on anything or on everything? Can Congress make acts of law for anything they desire? Can the executive branch administer on any regulation they wish? Can the Supreme Court rule on every matter? Have the people given them authority to do this? And if not, then by what authority are they acting on? When people in government go rogue and begin to act on their own, outside the power the citizens have given them, that government becomes very dangerous to the people. When people in government, bureaucrats, assume they can regulate on anything and on everything, then that is exactly what they do, and the liberties of the people are taken away. When the people push back, and they always do, the bureaucrats view those pushbacks as a threat to their power, and in almost every case in history, they begin to murder their own people. Over 170 million people in the 20th century alone have been murdered by people in their own government, after these governments achieved unchecked authority. The founders understood this danger. They listed very clearly what the federal government has authority to do, and beyond these, no power was or has been given. We American people are in a very precarious situation, whether we acknowledge it or not. We have a U.S. Congress that legislates acts for anything, acts that protect plants over people, putting citizens in prison for accidentally stepping on them, acts that can land you in jail for using the wrong light bulb, acts that force you to get health insurance or be fined and eventually imprisoned, acts that regulate the allowed temperature you can keep your home. The list goes on and is added to in every session. The majority of the acts of Congress today are illegal. They do not fall under the enumerated responsibilities the people delegated to them, and they break the constituted agreements between the states and the federal government. However, as bad as Congress may be, the executive branch is by far worse. They take these acts of Congress and manipulate them into anything they wish. They file in the Federal Registry codes that, in their view, are federal law, making these already unauthorized acts of Congress into tools to give federal agencies unlimited power.
We have to pass the bill so that you can find out what is in it away from the fog of the controversy.
With military-like force, they come down upon the American people and threaten them with compliance to their codes, none of it authorized by the people. These agencies have found a way to create their own laws without the people's elected representatives.
Of what we intended, and we had to back them off. See, the bureaucracy wants to interpret the laws we write in ways they want. And in this case, they were wrong. Not once, but twice. And then a couple years ago, I learned that despite the fact we created the first cow-free wilderness in the United States under this law, and said clearly in this law that it would be the responsibility of the government to put up fencing to keep the cows out as part of the agreement, the Bureau of Land Management said, no, we're not going to follow that law. And they told a rancher they had to build a fence. I networked with my Democrat colleague, Mr. DeFazio from Oregon, who was part of writing this law. I said, Peter, you remember that, right? He said, yeah, I didn't like it, but that was the case. BLM still wouldn't listen. So we continued to push it. And they argued back. Well, it turns out there had been a second rancher who brought this to my attention, who they were telling had to do the same thing, build the fence, when the government was supposed to, under the law I wrote. The agency, the arrogance of the agency was such that they said, we don't agree with you. Now, there aren't many times, Mr. Speaker, in this job when you can say, I know what the intent of a law was. But in this case, I could because I wrote the law. I knew the intent. Oh, that wasn't good enough. No. The arrogance of these agency people was such that we had to go to the archives and drag out the boxes from 2000 and 99, 2000, when we wrote this law, from the hearings that had all the records for the hearings and the floor discussion, to talk about the intent. And our retired member, George Miller, actually, we used some of his information where he said the government would provide the fencing. They were still reluctant to follow it. So I put language in the appropriations bill that restated the federal law. Do you understand how frustrated I am at this? Can you imagine how the people on the ground feel?
Over the past several decades, they have been organizing their own law enforcement regiments, building their own prison systems, and appointing their own judges. With this fraudulent system, they can arrest, prosecute, and incarcerate the American people for non-compliance to their arbitrary rules. All of this is done outside the proper legal system sanctioned by the people, making it futile for the American people to get justice when caught in this counterfeit judicial system, and making it feasible for bureaucrats to embezzle, abuse, oppress, incarcerate, and even murder the American people without afterwards even as much as an investigation.
Luca Brazzi held a gun to his head, and my father assured him that either his brains or his signature would be on the contract.
The American people are in a very precarious situation. To sum things up, the people created the federal government to perform specific duties that were better performed by a central government. The people gave the federal government authority to only perform those certain duties. The U.S. Constitution lists those certain duties. The federal government has neglected those duties, And U.S. Congress, with no respect for the people, are making acts way outside the list of authorized duties. Current and past presidents have created hundreds of federal agencies that have nothing to do with the listed responsibilities. And now these federal agencies have become so powerful that not even Congress or the president can rein them in or defund them.
Most people know that a new president gets to name over 4,000 political appointees when they're elected. This political cronyism is partisan politics, and it fills our bloated government with unqualified employees. Some people think that these are the people that comprise the deep state. But the deep state is much deeper than this. There's a much more sinister system in place that controls Washington, D.C.'s bureaucracies through an actual organized government. It's the heart of the swamp. The Washington, D.C. deep state is a group of 8,156 appointed managers in 75 federal agencies that control the power and tell the new political appointees what they can and cannot do. That's right. The deep state is an official government program, well-organized, comprehensive, and in charge. Out of the 8,156 members of these ensconced bureaucrats, over 7,000 were appointed by Obama. These are the Obama holdovers that still control the executive branch of government a full year after Trump has come to office. Obama expanded the existing program of managers and appointed over 7,000 of the 8,156 bosses, who are called the Senior Executive Service. Some call it the shadow government, and it's true that this federal cabal works in the shadows. Although the government clearly states that it's forbidden to have a Senior Executive Service system in the Department of Justice, accessing the last in the list of links I provided in the production notes proves otherwise. The names of the Senior Executive Service members are never revealed, but we do have a list of the people who give raises to the SES members in the Department of Justice. Raises for these SES members who don't exist but are the bosses. Take note of this lapel pin. It's worn by SES members, so they are able to identify one another. Now that you know who they are, going forward you'll be able to spot them and know that they're not promoting President Donald Trump's agenda. We need to take measures to end the Senior Executive Service and topple the deep state shadow government that has 8,156 operatives in 75 federal agencies, all still working to promote Barack Obama's political agenda.
These bureaucrats today understand that the American people are becoming weary to their actions. They are building up forces so they can stay in power when the American people finally realize that they are no more than modern-day conquerors, just self-appointed predators. Now, 2 questions. Are law-abiding citizens obligated to obey unauthorized laws, codes, or regulations? And is it the duty of the citizen to make sure people in government only exercise on the authority given them? To present such gloomy information without some solution would not seem honorable. Yes, the above facts are alarming and extremely concerning. History is repeating itself. But there is a way that we can protect our liberties from the buffetings of these bureaucratic bullies. It is not easy, but I have personally seen it happen successfully several times. One of the founding principles that this nation was built upon is the right to local self-government and the protection of it.
At the close of World War II, most American veterans returned from the battlefield looking forward to settling down to a peaceful life. But for the returning warriors of Athens, Tennessee, that dream became a nightmare. The men who had vanquished the forces of fascism overseas were now confronted by a new enemy at home, a local government rife with corruption and abuse. The conflict that followed pitted an entrenched political machine against an armed citizenry fed up with their overlords. It was known as the Battle of Athens, and it's the topic of tonight's Real History.
Athens, Tennessee in the mid-40s was the county seat of McMinn County. It had always been a hotbed of political dissent and political eruption. By 1940, the problem was that there was a political machine and they were pretty much dominating the lives of the people. People that would come through town on buses or trains could be regularly pulled off and beaten up, accused of some crime and thrown into jail. The more prisoners that went into jail, the more money that went into the sheriff's budget. There would have been all kinds of moonshine stills and illegal liquor, and so the sheriff would have gained money from them. There were all kinds of activities in which these male deputies almost had free reign of the female population. There was a large part of the male population that was away at war. It became a common theme by war's end, wait till the boys get back. It was like there was a kind of a crescendo of emotion that was building as these men began to drift back in after the war. There may have been a time in which they thought this was business as usual, but you had these men coming back saying, we fought for liberty in Europe and the Pacific. The men were encouraged to form a political party. The party was called the GI Nonpartisan Party. Election day was August the 2nd, 1946. The election was for all of the county offices, primarily and of most importance, the office of sheriff. The veterans had put a person forward on their nonpartisan ticket by the name of Knox Henry. And Knox Henry was kind of a grand figure. He was almost a John Wayne type person. And so he was the kind of person who would have garnered a lot of votes. Now, that being said, the political establishment kept saying to themselves that all they had to do was to control the ballot boxes. And so you had poll watchers, and these poll watchers would have been there from the establishment. Those were usually deputies, and they were usually armed. There would have been other poll watchers that would have come from the GI party, and those would have been veterans that were in there watching the votes. The first most dramatic event occurred on one of the main streets of Athens. Two of the GI watchers, a man named Shy Scott and a man named David Vestal, were in there with these deputies. There was a man in the community named Tom Gillespie. Tom Gillespie was an older African-American man. He was much beloved. He was highly respected. Immediately, these tough, ugly deputies feel like that's someone that they can easily not let vote. And so they push him back. And Tom Gillespie, very heroically, determines that he is going to vote. Finally, he's warned that if he doesn't leave, he's going to be shot. And at that moment, he says, I've come to vote. It's my right. And one of the deputies produces a gun and shoots Tom Gillespie on the spot. The deputies immediately shut down the precinct, and they are holding the two poll watchers captive inside the precinct. All of a sudden, you can hear sirens coming, and the sheriff and a whole group of heavily armed deputies come in, push the crowds back, and begin to clear out the ballot boxes and move them to the jail. Word is then spread throughout the county that voting precincts are to be shut down and ballot boxes are beginning to be brought to the jail. And so suddenly it's put up or shut up time. The sheriff and the deputies have barricaded themselves, heavily armed, in the county jail. It's like a fortress almost. A man named Mink Powers stepped in and took a leadership role, and he made it possible for some keys to the armory to show up. And so veterans began to go to the armory and began to bring weapons down to town. If you saw the kind of layout of the town, there is a small ridge that looks down over the area where the jail was. So, of course, these soldiers knew that that gave them tactical advantage that was just unbelievable. Everything was totally quiet. Everything had suddenly gotten dark. And gunfire erupts from the jail. That firing goes on for probably about 3 hours. I mean, it was like the Alamo almost in our TV images. A veteran that had been involved with munitions in the war taped together several sticks of dynamite. The dynamite blew off the whole front of the jail. And all of a sudden, the people in the jail believe this thing's been raised to a new level. So you literally have a white flag that is rigged and stuck out of the jail windows, and the people in the jail surrender. By the time that the next morning occurs, the veterans, the people from the business community in town, they were able to count the votes. The election was not even close. The Veterans GI Nonpartisan Party won by a majority. The legacy of these events are manifold. By the time that you get to the political events of 1948, there are numerous events like what happened at Athens that are repeated across the country. The GI Nonpartisan Party came very close to being the first vital third-party movement in America to really become successful.
Federalism by doctrine means that each level of government checks and balances the other levels. When any level of government begins to act outside the authority the people have given it, it is the right and the duty of the people and other levels of government to put that government back in its place. As a prudent society, we have been willed into thinking that the way to check and balance government is through the courts. This is simply not true for many reasons. The only way to ultimately check and balance and preserve liberties is by not allowing the action to continue. Federal, state, counties, and most important, the people, must not comply under any circumstance to legislation or regulation that violates the constituted agreements made with each other. We have found ourselves in this precarious situation because either we are ignorant to the constituted outlines or we are not brave enough to stand when we know something is not right. What the federal government is doing is illegal and will continue to destroy our freedoms until there are none left. The people must not stand for it. We have been the land of the free because of the brave. And if we do not exhibit bravery, suppressing fear, we cannot be free. This is an eternal principle. It is time for you to organize those around you and insist that your state, your county, your schools, and your city, and yourselves do not comply to the illegal, arbitrary action of the federal government.
We propose to dismantle two cabinet departments, Energy and Education. Both secretaries are wholly in accord with this. Some of the activities in both of these departments will, of course, be continued either independently or in other areas of government. There's only one way to shrink the size and cost of big government, and that is by eliminating agencies that are not needed and are getting in the way of a solution. Now, we don't need an energy department to solve our basic energy problem. As long as we let the forces of the marketplace work without undue interference, the ingenuity of consumers, business, producers, and inventors will do that for us. Similarly, education is the principal responsibility of local school systems, teachers, parents, citizen boards, and state governments. By eliminating the Department of Education less than 2 years after it was created, we can not only reduce the budget, but ensure that local needs and preferences, rather than the wishes of Washington, determine the education of our children.
My name is Charlotte Thompson-Nisserbate, and I served as Senior Policy Advisor in the United States Department of Education under the Reagan administration, during which I had access to all of the most important documents for the restructuring of not only American education, but global education. And I'm also the author of The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America, which gets into all of this, gives the background of what I saw not only in the Department of Education, but as a local school board member. I was trained to identify the resistors to the sex ed, drug ed, alcohol ed, suicide ed, death ed, those good, smart Americans who realize that anything that has education hanging off the end of it is probably not what they're looking for. I was trained to identify those good people and to go up against them, and actually to go and try to get them to join us through the group process system, make them feel important, get them on a committee. And that just blew my mind. I have to say, people often ask me, what is it that got you involved in education? Well, finding out what I saw at the local level certainly upset me. When I went and I saw that Americans were being trained to identify resistors, then I got pretty upset. And luckily, there was a big book that came with the in-service training called Innovations in Education, A Change Agent's Guide. And I was able to take that back home with me. Unbelievable examples of how to con the Christians and different people who are upset with what you're trying to do, how to bring them over to your side, case studies, true case studies of educators who had put programs in that normally, in a normal American town, nobody would want them. How did they manage to get them in? How did they con the people? And the other thing was, not only was I trained to identify the resistors, I was trained to go to the important people, high profile, highly thought of people in the community, with the Rotary, and Chamber of Commerce, Garden Club, you name it, the different groups in our towns. Go to them and convince them of the importance of these new programs like sex ed, drug ed, I just mentioned all of them, and to get them on your side, because when you can get the leadership in a community to go along with it, then the newspaper comes in and says, a committee's been set up with the head of the Rotary and this and that, and they're all getting behind this task force to discuss whether we're going to have a new sex education program. And then when Mary Jones, who ordinarily would think, why would we want to have a sex education program when we don't have any problems with kids having sex or anything? So she might be concerned. She might be one of the resistors. She reads that her best friend, who's the head of the Garden Club, is on this committee, and she thinks, oh, well, hey, Mary Appleton is on that committee. She's heading it up. It must be okay. So I was taught really how to con the community. They always call everybody by the first name. You have to get very, affectionate with people, and you say, William, I'm so glad you've come to this meeting, and I understand your concerns about this program because, I've had other people, usually it's the really bright people in the community who have these concerns, and would you like to join our group? The original program was funded by what would subsequently become my office. It was funded by the Office of Research in the U.S. Office of Education, because it was funded early on, about the late 60s. Still funded, by the way. And the money went to the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor to a professor by the name of Ronald Havelock. And he was the one that put together the whole training, the whole seminar, the book. And in the back of the book they admitted it. Right in the back of the book, they had about 100 major change agents listed from all over the country. Some of them I recognize, some I still don't, but some I do. And so this was a very important project. And it was being, carried out I'm sure, all over the country, not just where I was. This was in Searsport, Maine, this lovely little town on the coast of Maine, in the school there where the guy came in, the facilitator, not Professor Havelock, but a facilitator, to train us. And these were good people that were there. They were some of the teachers from my school, where I was on the local school board, principals, etc. Normal-looking Americans. You really ask yourself, they must themselves have reacted very much the way I did. That's why I've always had a lot of understanding for teachers that have to go through this stuff. I didn't have to continue going through it. They've had to, through the years, constant training, retraining, sensitivity training, break their values. Right, no wrong. You've got to have all religions represented, so, tolerant of everything, and because that's the New World disorder, excuse me. Professor Benjamin Bloom is probably the most important behavioral psychologist ever to live. I mean, maybe not quite as much as Pavlov and Skinner, but he really implemented the system in education in the United States. And he was the author of the Taxonomy of Educational Objectives. And I know that doesn't mean much to us. It means a lot to teachers. They know. All teachers have to go through that, Bloom's taxonomy. And just to give you an idea of how blatant they are, Benjamin Bloom said the purpose of education, and I often say this to parents, really, listen to this. You think the purpose of education is reading, writing, and arithmetic? The purpose of education is to change the thoughts, actions, and feelings of students. And then he goes on and he says, he defines good teaching, and this is even worse from the parental standpoint, as challenging the student's fixed beliefs. And then, in some of his works that I have, that are in my book, a lot of this stuff is in it.
When he says challenge, does he mean challenge or does he mean change? Change their fixed?
Yeah, through challenging. It's through challenging. You go up against them, and you change them. And you asked a good question, because then he goes on in one part of the taxonomy that is in my book, he says that he can take a student from here to there, from a belief in God or his country or whatever, to being an atheist and not believing in his country in 1 hour.
Did he do that?
Oh yeah, he does it. And I've seen it with students. I've seen it with young people. And they don't even know, and teachers don't even know. That's why if you talk to teachers about it often, they'll really have an awfully hard time dealing with it. And if you go up to a superintendent, an educational administrator, superintendent or whatever, and you ask him or her, have you ever been through sensitivity training? They'll usually crack up because they went through it. They're the worst, those programs. I've been through them. I mean, how can anything be worse than some of the ones that the regular classroom has, but they're the worst.
What do they teach the children?
To bring about change. They put them through role-playing, psychodrama, all these psychological techniques where they play the part of starving children, and the other one plays the part of a very wealthy industrialist child. And, you know, they bring about the attitude and value change through the emotions. You know how young people are. You know, they're naturally very altruistic, and they want to help, and they don't like to see poverty around the world. And so what they'll do is, just like I think I mentioned to you earlier, or I don't know whether I did, going into the teacher putting in the new social studies program in our community and walking through, taking the little tots through town and identifying big rich people's houses and small poor people's houses. That's a perfect example of what I'm talking about. Getting them young and making them feel sorry for the people who live in the trailer across from the captain's house, because they only eat hot dogs, not steak. And then they'll do the same thing with Ethiopia or wherever, some third world country, showing them the children dying, and then they'll show pictures of our affluence. And what do you eat for breakfast? Oh, you have eggs and bacon and cereal and orange juice and grapefruit and everything. Yum, yum, yum. Do you really think it's fair? Common unity. That's what we call it, common unity. It is no role for the individual in the community, and for everything that goes on in the Soviet Union or communism is based on the community, the commune.
Okay, welcome to Education in the Constitution. This is the third in the Constitution seminar series that I do. It is the most recent one I've developed, even though I'm filming it before the other ones, because I feel like it's an important issue. It's a hot issue right now with Common Core. We're going to talk a lot about Common Core today. And hopefully you can apply the principles and concepts that we learned about the specific program to many different areas of government. So we're going to get into the Constitution and find out what it has to say about education. So first of all, the quote by Aristotle: "All who have meditated on the art of governing mankind have been convinced that the fate of empires depends on the education of youth." That makes sense, because empires are perpetual, they're generational. And in order to go from one generation to the next, it is passing on those values and ideas and teachings that will keep the empire going. Okay? Now it's interesting, you look at someone like Vladimir Lenin. If we were to give him a score on the freedom scale, okay, from 0 to 10, what would he have? At best a 0, right? Maybe even negative. But he says this, and it's an interesting comment: "Give me 4 years to teach the children, and the seed I've sown will never be uprooted." Now, even though he had evil intentions and he wasn't a governor for freedom, it was still what he says is true. Give me 4 years to teach and indoctrinate your children, and I'll have control over them. And that's true. So it's not necessarily whether it's good or bad, but education itself can change generations, can change people. Now, on the other side of the coin, we have someone who's a 10, on my scale at least, George Washington. He says a primary object should be the education of our youth in the science of government. In a republic, what species of knowledge can be equally important and what duty more pressing than communicating it to those who are to be the future guardians of the liberties of the country? We are in a republic, are we not? A rule of law. And if we're living in a republic, we have got to teach true values to those who are going to live in it and the next generation who will be the eventual leaders of our country. And so it's important and imperative to pass that on. The true purpose of education is to pass on those values, those truths that are time-tested from one generation to the next. That's the idea, that's the concept. Okay? And Jefferson says, if a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be. What a great quote, right? Because ignorance doesn't attract freedom. Ignorance attracts tyrants. Because tyrants know the best way to rule over people is to have them be ignorant, to not understand the rights, to not understand true principles. Okay? Whereas education attracts freedom. Only truly educated people are a free people. Pretty simple. Now, Washington again, he says, the best means of forming a manly, virtuous, and happy people will be found in the right education of youth. Without this foundation, every other means, in my opinion, must fail. So very similar to these other 3 or 4 quotes, he's saying it's all dependent upon education. But he puts a qualifier in there, he puts a value statement, and he qualifies that by saying the right education of youth. Okay, so not just education, but the right education. And so you wonder, well, what's right education? What is this? What's this mean? I mean, it's obviously a subjective term. Well, right, in my mind, has 2 different parts to it, 2 different points. The first is the source of the education, and the second is the content. Okay? So the source of education and the content of education will constitute whether it's a right education or not, whether it's wrong, whether it's bad. Okay? So let's look at a quote from a founding father, not very famous, but nonetheless a great founding father, James Wilson, in reference to the source of education. He says, it's the duty of parents to maintain their children decently. So it's the duty of who? Parents. That should be the source of education, should be parents. And according to their circumstances, to protect them according to the dictates of prudence, and to educate them according to the suggestions of a judicious and zealous regard for their usefulness, their respectability, and happiness. So if parents are providing that education, shouldn't parents then be the ones to determine and approve and deliver the education? Sure. What's interesting nowadays is our education system is set up by the system for the system. But originally the founders said what we want education from the parent. The reason that the education exists in the first place is because parents said we're going to make this system, put this together, hire a local school teacher to teach our children. Because that's our job, is to teach our children. We're the ones who are supposed to be the source of education. So we're the ones who are going to determine where the education comes from and who's going to be providing that. Okay? So the first is the source, and it's very clear from Wilson and just from logic itself, says parents are the source. The second thing is its content. Now, in researching this, this presentation, I got to learn a lot of good things. One of them was that there are 4 original source, or what they call organic documents, to the foundation of America. I didn't realize the 4th one. I knew the first 3. The Declaration of Independence, that makes sense. The Articles of Confederation, and the Constitution. Those 3 make total sense. The 4th one is new to me. Okay, it's called the Northwest Ordinance. Northwest Ordinance is an organic document. It's very fundamental to the foundation of our country because it taught us how we're going to grow, how the Republic's going to expand. And in this, in Article 3 of the Northwest Ordinance of 1789, it says this very clearly in regards to what is the substance of education. What's the content? Religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. Okay? So pretty clearly, what does it say? One of the very first laws of the very first Congress was religion, morality, virtue. Okay? Those truths, those values that are transferred from one generation to another. That's the content. That's what education is supposed to be about. So now if you have an education system that says, no, we can't do those things, or an education system that takes it one step further and says, we shouldn't do those things, it's wrong to teach those things, then what would the founders say? They'd say, well, why are you doing education in the first place then? That's what it's about. That's why you have education, is to encourage these values, religion, morality, virtue, knowledge. So you look at that and say, oh, we got our source and we got our content. And you understand what right education of youth is, according to Washington. That kind of backs up with this idea, this famous quote that I use a lot. John Adams says, our Constitution is made only for a moral and religious people. It's wholly inadequate to the government of any other. Because if we don't have that religion, morality, that virtue to govern ourselves, then the Constitution is not going to work too well, because no amount of government can make you moral. That's the purpose of education. That's what we're trying to do, is instill and inculcate in the next generation true values. Okay? So we've kind of talked about the founding documents of our countries and founding ideas and quotes from the founding fathers. Now let's talk about maybe a more modern law here. I found this gem, I think, in the Wyoming State Statute 21-9-102, and here's what it says. All schools and colleges in this state that are supported in any manner by public funds shall give instruction in the essentials of the United States Constitution and the Constitution of the State of Wyoming, including the study of and devotion to American institutions and ideals. So let's stop right there for a second. The study of is kind of your mind, right? You're learning about American institutions. The study of, and then it goes on to say the devotion to, I almost lost where I was, devotion to American ideals and institutions. Isn't that interesting? A devotion to is more of a heartfelt thing, isn't it? A study of is your mind. A devotion to is a feeling for, a passion for American institution and ideals. Ideals, is that a value statement? You bet it is. And why would it be critical that people in the public schools, children in the public schools, are taught a devotion to American ideals? Because that's what found our country. And if we don't pass that on, what are we going to have? We're not going to have our country anymore, are we? We're just going to have an empty set of children who understand fun facts and figures, maybe, about the Constitution, but don't understand what it means to have a devotion to the ideals. Okay? Now, it's interesting because the very next, let me finish the statute, I guess, here. It says, and no student shall receive a high school diploma, associate degree, or baccalaureate degree without satisfactorily passing an examination on the principles of the Constitution of the United States and the State of Wyoming. The instruction shall be given for at least 3 years in kindergarten through grade 8 and for 1 year each in the secondary and college grades. It's a pretty interesting, now you know why I call it a gem. I think it's very explicit. Even the lawmakers in our state see the imperative nature, why it's so important to teach these ideals and to make sure they happen. It's interesting because 21-9-103, the very next statute, says this in its entirety. Willful failure on the part of any school or college administrator or instructor to carry out the requirements of Wyoming State Statute 21-9-102, this one we just read, shall be sufficient cause for the removal of such person from his position. Now, I never advocate using that as a threat, ever, okay? But what we want to do is understand they're dead serious about this. This is very important. So if we were to talk to our school board, talk to our superintendent, talk to our principals and say, hey, this statute says we need to teach a devotion to American ideals. How are you doing that? It's required. Not only is it required, but it says that your job's on the line. Your job's dependent upon you teaching this. Now, when I was in school, I wasn't taught that. I wasn't taught American ideals, a devotion to them. I was taught maybe fun facts and figures. You have to be 35 to be president. Okay, how many senators from each state, but that's not a devotion to American ideals. Those are just study of the institutions, right? What about the devotion to the American ideals? That's critical, and it's important. It's essential to the essence of education, isn't it? To understand true government, how it should work. Okay?
As you do this from time to time, you may have to rely on the people for protection.
No, the time is now. We're doing that. No, the time is to push these people back so they can do the same thing. Push them back so they can do the same thing. We respect your authority as county.
As my father, Clive Bundy, says, come home, America. Take care of your county where you can make a difference. Stop worrying so much about who is running for president or for Congress. They are nearly all lost to the people. It is time to elect county sheriffs and commissioners that are brave enough to check and balance all other governments when they try to take the lives, liberties, and properties away from the citizens. If this is done correctly, we may enjoy freedom a little longer, and possibly even pass it on to our children. Rights are not protected in the courts. In fact, they are usually diminished there. Rights are protected on the grounds that they were established. Remember, you cannot expect your sheriff to defend your rights when you are not willing to defend them yourself.
A category of government activity that poses the gravest danger to our continued freedom is the activity not within the proper sphere of government. The Constitution provides the federal government with no authority to grant such powers as welfare programs, schemes for redistributing the wealth, and activities that coerce people into acting in accordance with a prescribed code of social planning. There is one simple test to the constitutionality of a principle. Do I, as an individual, have a right to use force upon my neighbor to accomplish this goal? If I do, then I may delegate that power to my government to exercise it in my behalf. If I do not have that right, I cannot delegate it. If we permit government to manufacture its own authority and to create self-proclaimed powers not delegated to it by the people, then the creature exceeds the creator and becomes master. Who is to say, this far but no farther? What clear principle will stay the hand of government from reaching farther and farther into our daily lives? Grover Cleveland said that though the people support the government should not support the people. Once government steps over this clear line between the protective or negative role into the aggressive role of redistributing the wealth through taxation and providing so-called benefits for some of its citizens, it becomes a means for legalized plunder. Examples abound in the world of the failure of alternative systems to the free market. What amazes me is that we cannot see from their example the obvious failure of socialism, what it does to a nation's economy, and how it morally debilitates a people. Great Britain is a tragic example of this. I was there just a short time ago. Here is a nation that I love, and here is a nation which has provided the free world with a tradition of freedom and democratic rights stemming from Magna Carta and coming down through other important historical documents and statements by famous Englishmen. Yet England today is losing her freedom. She has become a giant welfare state. Today, government spending in Britain amounts to 60% of her total national income. This is socialism. Medical doctors under socialized medicine are leaving Great Britain in record numbers, as are thousands of others. British Prime Minister James Callaghan, in a speech last September, said, quote, "We used to think that you could just spend your way out of a recession and increase employment by cutting taxes and boosting government spending. I tell you in all candor that that option no longer exists, and that insofar as it ever did exist, it only worked by injecting bigger doses of inflation into the economy, followed by higher levels of unemployment as the next step. That is the history of the past 20 years," unquote. Such a confession has led the renowned economist Dr. Milton Friedman to comment, quote, "That must surely rank as one of the most remarkable and courageous statements ever made by a leader of a democratic government. Read it again, savor it. It is a confession of the intellectual bankruptcy of the policy that has guided every British government in the post-war period, not only Labour governments, but also Tory governments, of the policy that has guided almost every other Western government, including the United States, under both Republican and Democratic administrations, of the policy that is now being recommended to Mr. Carter by his advisors," unquote. Consider another example. Our neighbor to the north, Canada. For 20 years, 1944 to 1964, Saskatchewan, Canada, lived under a socialist government. Here is what their premier, the Honorable W. Ross Thatcher, said about this experience, quote, "In 1944, the socialists said they would solve the unemployment problems by building government factories. They promised to use the profits to build highways, schools, hospitals, and to finance better social welfare measures generally. Over the years, they set up 22 so-called crown or government corporations. By the time we had taken over, at the end of the 20-year period, 12 of the crown corporations had gone bankrupt or been disposed of. Others were kept operating by repeated and substantial government grants. During the whole period, the socialists waged war against private business. The making of profits was condemned as an unforgivable sin. What was the result? Investors simply turned their backs on the socialists. Dozens of oil companies pulled up stakes and moved out. Gas exploration ground to a complete halt. Prospecting in our vast north became almost non-existent. During the period, Canada was experiencing the greatest economic boom in her history. Saskatchewan received only a handful of new factories. After 18 years of socialism, there were fewer jobs in manufacturing than existed in 1945. This despite the investment of $500 million in crown corporations. During the period, more than 600 completely new taxes were introduced. 650 other taxes were increased. Per capita taxes in Saskatchewan were soon substantially out of line with our sister provinces. One more reason why industry located elsewhere. The socialists promised to make Saskatchewan a mecca for the working man. Instead, we saw the greatest mass exodus of people out of an area since Moses led the Jews out of Egypt. Since the war, 270,000 of our citizens left Saskatchewan to find employment elsewhere. If there are any Americans who think that socialism is the answer, I wish they would come to Saskatchewan to study what has happened to our province." Unquote. We say it can't happen here. The lesson of New York City should tell us that this same thing is happening here to us now. As Dr. Friedman has pointed out, New York City is no longer governed by its elected officials. It is governed by a committee of overseers appointed by the state of New York. New York City has partially lost its freedom. When will we learn the lesson? That fiscal irresponsibility leads to a loss of self-government. When will we learn that when you lose economic independence, you lose political freedom? We have accepted a frightening degree of socialism in our country. The question is how much? The amount of freedom depends upon the amount of federal control and spending. A good measurement is to determine the amount or percentage of income of the people which is taken over and spent by the state. In Russia, the individual works almost wholly for the state, leaving little for his own welfare. Scandinavia takes about 65 to 70% of the increase of the people. England, some 60%. The United States is now approximately 44%. America was built on the principle of faith in God, self-reliance, the profit motive, individual action, and voluntary charity. It was built by those who believed that the surest helping hand was at the end of their own sleeves. These forefathers of ours shared one thing in common: an unshakable faith in God and a faith in themselves. There are indications that America is moving away from the philosophy that made her the most prosperous nation in the world.
We've been occupying here for 16 days. The Hammonds have been in prison for 14. That is way too long. This is not just a little occupation. This is a movement that's taking place across our country. And I want you to know that this Friday at 4 p.m. here on site, we're holding a signing ceremony. We have ranchers that have committed here in Harney County, and ranchers from New Mexico, and we're hoping that the ones in Utah will make it too, that are traveling here to have a signing ceremony and throw off the overlordship of the federal government. There's been some great articles that have come out here. I've only got to look at a couple of them, but like Joe Heim, Washington Post, I thought he did a fairly good job in an article that he gave out. Pretty fair representation. I texted him back, said, Joe, I appreciate it, but there's one correction. There was says the anti-government, and I hear that's in a lot of articles, the anti-government people. But I'm calling this out here. We are not anti-government. We're not anti-federal government. I believe in the federal government. We believe in the federal government. We need the federal government. The federal government has some very specific responsibilities, such as keeping our borders secure, defending our nation, keeping commerce regular, and just a few other narrowly defined things. So I'm going to say that again. We are not anti-government.
There was a time that I could see that they was basically trying to manage us out of business, and I said no. And then, you know, a little time I said, hell no. You're not going to manage my preemptive rights that's been created to beneficial use of blood and tears of my family and my predecessors. You're not going to take that away from me and my family and my kids. And so I said no. And so what I did then is I quit signing the contracts with the federal government. But when I quit signing the contracts, I wasn't sure what I was doing. But it wasn't very long that I started to learn that I was constitutionally right. The federal government had no business claiming ownership of this land in the United States. And the more I learned, the stronger I got. And that's evolved to this day. And I'll tell you what I have learned. If we're ever going to get away from it, well, let me put a blame. These bureaucracies have got so strong, and I'm talking about BLM and Forest Service and Park Service and EPA and on and on and on. They've got so strong now that it don't matter who we elect for President of the United States. It don't matter who we elect for Congress. It don't matter who we elect for our judges or the appointed judges. The legal part don't work, and the political part works. And you know why? It's because the bureaucrat has got so fat and so healthy that he is the one that prospers. He's the one that has life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The rest of us are feeding him. And when you get to this point, I've been to this point for 20 years. I said, no, I'm not going to sign contracts with you, and I'm not going to pay you no more. But I said 20 years ago, if 10 ranchers would followed me, we'd have had this thing beat a long time ago. Today, we still don't have it beat. And what I want to say here is I want to paint a picture in your eye of a picture of America, the big map of America. And about half of that map is covered with red, and it's claiming United States property, under control of the federal government. Well, every bit of that red, and I'm going to use the word every bit of that red is within admitted states. So show me in the Constitution where the federal government can own any property within admitted states, except very little, like Washington D.C. and Article 1, 8, and 17 property. They can't own property in admitted states. Now, before it was admitted state, it was a territory. It's territory Utah, territory Nevada. Well, when it was in a territory state, we the people of the territory didn't have the Constitution. Congress had unlimited power to dispose of and make all rules and regulations under territory law. And that's what they're trying to treat us ranchers like now. They want to say, we have unlimited power. We have rules, terms and conditions you have to follow. And if you don't follow them, you know what happens? You end up in a federal court. And where in a federal court did anybody ever win? When did a rancher, a resource user, ever win in a federal court? You can't win in that federal court. It's their court. Now let me bring you back to that map. Every bit of that red on that map on the western United States, and you guys report as ranchers in our industry, you know that the federal government claims property on that red part of that map. But I'll tell you, in 1934, the Taylor-Grazing Act was passed, and I don't agree with the Taylor-Grazing Act. I don't believe it's constitutional, but let's go ahead and accept the Taylor-Grazing Act. What they did in the Taylor-Grazing Act is the rancher paid the federal government to map their preemptive, adjudicated, property rights, and the federal government mapped them and drew lines and said this property, these property rights here belong to this rancher, this property right belongs to that rancher. So now we have our ranches adjudicated. We know where our ranches are, and it's mapped, and it's a record. All of that map is, remember, within a admitted state. Now, we the rancher paid for that work. We paid for the service to do our mapping. After they got it adjudicated, then we continued on paying for get fences and water lines and range improvements. We continued to pay the federal government for a service. But pretty soon the federal government got to saying, well, we are the managers, we're the stewards, and now we're the owner, and we have unlimited power, and now we have multiple uses coming in here, and ranchers, you're not important no more, and we don't even want you here no more. And so people like me, we claim we have preemptive rights created through beneficial use. Now, how in the heck did the bureaucracy get that much power? I mean, they are just bureaucracies. They're not elected officials. None of them are elected officials. They have no policing power. But how did they get that power? Well, let me tell you how they get that power. There are probably maybe 100,000 ranchers that ranch on that red part of the United States. Every bit of that red was either sheep or cattle grazing at one time. Every bit of it has been adjudicated to a rancher, an individual. Now, who's the stewards over the land? Who's the stewards over all that red? Isn't it the rancher? Isn't he the one that's got the rights? Isn't it been adjudicated and mapped? And he is the steward over that land. So again, how in the heck in America can the federal government own all that land? So let me tell you how they can. They own that land and control that land because we, the rancher, signs that grazing permit. And when we sign the bottom of that grazing permit, we're telling the federal government they have unlimited power, just like they had when it was a territory. And we have all of these bureaucrats now, and you know, they come with all of that power because we signed our rights away. We tell the federal government, you have unlimited power. Now, what happens if we have, if the federal government has unlimited power and we've signed that contract? I'm talking about signing that grazing permit or that grazing license. That's what Lavoie was trying to teach the world. That's how come he got killed. They don't want him to teach that kind of stuff. But let me tell you something. When you sign that contract, you're signing the Constitution, your state, your rights away because you give them unlimited power. Now let's just take a little instance here. We have a problem, and we've been, you know, the Federal Land Conference and everybody, for years we've talked about government closest to we the peoples. We talked about the county government being the proper form of government. We're talking about sheriffs having policing power. Well, let me tell you something. Let's talk about the sheriff right here in Kane County. We call him up, and we have a problem out on our ranch. And the county sheriff, he'll say, I can't help you. You've signed my jurisdiction away. You have a contract with the federal government. Call a BLM or a Forest Service and let them come and help you. And he's right. We have signed our constitutional rights away. The sheriff can't help us. Our county commissioner can't help us. Our governor can't help us. Why? Because we have a contract with the federal government.
Bullies thrive when they're able to isolate their victims and when they're able to control all the information related to their actions. Case in point, the differing conclusions of Ruby Ridge, Waco, and the Bundy Ranch. Ruby Ridge, what happened? A man named Randy Weaver was accused of selling shotguns that were, per the dictates of some self-proclaimed rulers, too short, a quarter inch too short to be specific. After Weaver refused to work with the ATF as an informant, he was threatened in legal land with weapons charges. He was mailed the incorrect date of when to show up. So the ATF assembled a grand jury who indicted Weaver, and then they called the U.S. Marshals to round him up. The Marshals surveilled Weaver and his family for 16 months, and they eventually sent some employees up his property clad in camo, night vision goggles, and wielding M16s. At the time, Randy Weaver, his 14-year-old son Sammy, their 2 dogs, and family friend, 25-year-old Kevin Harris, had been out hunting on the property. One of the Marshal employees threw a rock to gauge the reaction of the dogs. One of them, a yellow lab named Stryker, approached the sound, and the Marshal shot and killed the dog. Sammy, who only knew that trespassers were on the property, fired twice as he ran back up the mountain. Marshal employee Deegan then fatally shot Sammy in the back. Kevin Harris turned and fired 1 shot from the hip, hitting Deegan in the chest and killing him. The Marshals then called their friends, and before long, over 400 other folks wearing badges were present on the scene. They erected roadblocks and checkpoints to prevent area residents and friends of the Weavers from getting anywhere close to them and to disallow the Weavers from getting any real aid. Though negotiations were supposedly in the plans, Dick Rogers, the head of the FBI's hostage rescue team present on the scene, told his snipers to essentially shoot on sight. A short time later, when Randy Weaver went to the shed to visit his now deceased son, FBI employee Lou Harichi fired. The bullet entered Randy's shoulder and exited his armpit. Randy ran back to the cabin. Randy's wife Vicky was standing in the doorway. She was holding their 10-month-old baby. She posed no threat. Yet Harichi fired a second shot and hit Vicky in the face, killing her. The bullet exited Vicky's skull, and it, and her skull fragments, hit Kevin Harris, who'd been nearby, puncturing his lung and causing other injuries. After 12 days of negotiations led by Bo Gritz, Randy Weaver, his surviving family, and friend Kevin Harris left the property. Without question, the incident at Ruby Ridge resonated with many. The gross unaccountability and the unnecessary violence stained the perception many folks had of federal police employees. It was in that context that those at the ATF sought to improve their standing, always seen as being second tier to the FBI. They set their sights on a group of people just northeast of Waco, Texas. One way the Davidians supported themselves was by buying firearms and later selling them at gun shows. This drew the attention of ATF employees, and though the Davidians had invited the ATF employees to check the legality of their firearms, the ATF chose not to, believing this high-profile raid would be best for their image. They thought they'd just easily roll onto the property of the Branch Davidians, parade them all out in handcuffs, and levy firearms charges against them. But that's not what happened. On February 28, 1993, 2 trucks pulling cattle trailers rolled onto the Davidian property, out of which 75 ATF employees emerged. One of the employees fired a round through the Davidians' metal front door, resulting in a firefight. Before too long, 10 people in total had been killed. Just like at Ruby Ridge, lots of their friends with badges were called in. FBI employees got military hardware, including M1 Abrams tanks, by claiming a drug war nexus, which circumvented the Posse Comitatus law, which said that no military hardware could be used in the USSA. A siege ensued, and the Davidians were purposefully cut off from their community. In the nighttime, FBI employees and their colleagues would shine spotlights in the Davidians' windows. They blasted through speakers the sounds of jets and animals being slaughtered. Supporters and reporters were kept over a mile away. The Davidians, in an attempt to share what was going on, wrote messages on bed sheets and hung them from the windows. At one point, FBI employees provided the Davidians with a video camera. They told the Davidians to record their testimonies, to share what was going on, and that they would then make that public. However, once the FBI was given the video camera back with all the recordings, they decided to not share that, to not make it public, because they felt that it would allow people to sympathize with the Davidians. Eventually, 51 days after the ATF employees had started the firefight, FBI employees and their colleagues started ramming heavy machinery and tanks into the Davidian structure and inserting CS gas. All the while, an Orwellian recording that stated, "This is not an attack," was playing. Soon after, due to the presence of the high Texas winds and the chemicals of the CS gas, a fire started. The property was engulfed almost immediately. Yet, just like the reporters and the members of the public, the fire trucks were kept at the checkpoint over a mile away. In total, 76 Davidians were killed, including 20 children. And when the FBI turned the scene over to the Texas Rangers for forensics, they had already removed over 9,000 cubic feet of dirt, including shell casings, CS rounds, and even the metal front door from the property. Bundy Ranch was a bit different. Though, like Ruby Ridge and Waco, hundreds of badged folks were present, they weren't able to have their way and then cover their tracks. The reason? There were hundreds of supporters on the property, many who filmed and some who were armed. Just like Ruby Ridge and Waco, there are a lot of background details involved with this incident, so I encourage you to learn more about them. But essentially it comes down to a land grab. One man, Cliven Bundy, a rancher and father of 14, refused to fall in line. Bundy's family had been raising cattle in the area since 1877. In 1954, the Bureau of Land Management, or BLM, told Bundy and other ranchers that they needed to sign an annual permit to use land for foraging and water rights. In exchange for the permit fee, the BLM claimed that it would help to improve the property by doing things like erect fences. For years, Bundy had signed the BLM permit and paid the fee, but in 1993, after the BLM changed the fine print on what they could do, giving themselves more authority, Bundy refused to sign. Many ranchers saw this change as the BLM actively trying to squeeze them out to obtain the land. The BLM employees then turned to their friends in Legal Land, who ruled against Bundy and at one point said that he owed the BLM $200 per day per head of cattle that was on the land. On April 5th, 2014, hundreds of federal employees, contract cowboys, and airplanes and helicopters descended on Bundy's land. But word got out. Bundy had a blog on which those interested could sign up to be on his action list and receive notifications if and when their assistance was needed. Soon neighbors and folks who had known Bundy and his family for their lifetime were demanding answers and asking questions. And soon after that, supporters who had never met Bundy but who knew of the incident arrived on the scene. Though there were a couple of tense moments early on, 57-year-old Margaret Houston, a cancer survivor, had been pushed down by a BLM employee, and one of Cliven Bundy's sons had been kidnapped and caged for the night. Eventually the situation was brought to a conclusion, at least very visible threats made by BLM employees with firearms, when, after telling the growing crowd that you need to leave the area, the crowd did not, and in fact they advanced upon the BLM. As one reporter present noted, they were peaceful yet determined. Bundy, a religious man at one point, stated, "I don't stand alone. I have all of the prayers from lots of people around the world, and I feel those prayers, and those prayers take the tremble out of my legs, and I can stand strong and straight. To put it another way, we're safer when we have each other's back. It's not surprising that those who seek to control us try to keep us divided. Perhaps nothing then is more powerful than our unity in together confronting bullies, no matter their attire."
The day that my husband Lavoy was murdered, assassinated by our government, they had been invited by Sheriff Palmer to speak to the citizens in his county in the city of John Day. This is what I know about the ambush. 1, they were stopped. They placed their hands and their heads out of the window to show that they were unarmed, letting them know that there were women in the truck. 2, shots were fired at them, missing all of them. Then 3, Ryan Payne was taken into custody. 4, Lavoy continues with his hands and head out of the truck, and he is yelling at them that he is going to the sheriff's in John Day for protection. Number 5, they fire upon the truck again, and that is when Lavoy leaves for protection in the neighboring county. That is why he leaves. He leaves not knowing that just up ahead they have set up a kill stop for him. Some have wondered why he tried to go around that kill stop. I haven't. I know my husband. He had 2 seconds to decide what he was going to do. He had three choices. One, he could turn to the right and wreck the vehicle, and everybody inside the vehicle would be injured or killed. Two, he could go forward and plow into those officers who were there in that kill stop, and then he would be responsible for killing them or himself and others in the truck. Or three, he could choose the less risky, less dangerous direction, and that was to turn to the left into the 3 foot of snow, which stopped the truck, and everyone in it was still safe. I know that he was constantly thinking of the safety of others because he valued life. I know that he, as he immediately exited the truck with his hands in the air, which was clear to see, that he was again thinking of others. I know that when he left that truck with his hands in the air, that he again was trying to divert attention away from the people that he cared about in the truck to himself, thereby having all of the officers that were clearly there in wait, in the trees, in the brush, to focus their attention on him.
And it may cost you everything, but that's okay. I want to kind of end a little bit with a story. You know, Christmas morning, Christmas Eve, there was a gentleman that I have great respect for called George Washington. He crossed the Delaware with his soldiers, and he took on the Hessians, the British Hessians, and you know, he lost not one soldier to the armed conflict. There was 150 that were wounded. But he did lose two that died before they even got there. 2 men froze to death before they arrived there. And the bloody foot tracks could be traced in the snow. Now, why is my life more valuable than their life? They gave their all, didn't even get the chance to fire their musket. They died frozen. I'm sure they had loved ones, mothers, fathers, probably children, that their dreams were cut off, but they gave their all for this freedom. Why do we reap the fruits and the rewards of their sacrifices, and then when it comes down to this time that we don't stand up? Will you be able to hold your head up? Will I be able to hold my head up when we meet together? If I don't stand, I can't. They gave everything, and so many people have given everything. It's time to stand. I want anybody that hears this, please pull your courage to the sticking point. Strengthen your resolve, stiffen your back. Let's stand. It may cost you your life. That's okay. Just like I said to that cowboy, we all die. You know, die for something good. Let your children, your posterity know where you stood, where you stand. Don't disappoint your ancestors. This is the day of the time.